Okay, hi. Yeah, my name is Riley, and Penny is my PM on this project, which is called Isolated Web Apps. Can I get the next slide? So I want to start with a couple observations about kind of where we are with the web platform and the capabilities work that we've been doing. So first off, the web is really successful. Developers like building applications with web technology. And they like doing this even when these applications aren't sort of published, quote unquote, on the web. We have things like Electron apps on desktop. WebView is really popular on mobile as a part of native applications. And for server-side code and development tools, we have people using JavaScript in the form of things like Node.js and Deno. So it's generally the case that there's some power to this idea of having a standardized language and features and libraries that allows code sharing and developer expertise to transfer between a whole bunch of different platforms and form factors. We've also noticed that some applications have a really advanced threat model. So for example, how do you protect yourself against a compromise of your own infrastructure? As an example, encrypted messengers like Signal and WhatsApp promise that you don't have to trust their servers for the protocol to be secure. But there's a problem, which is that if the client happens to be a web application, then the code comes from the server. So the protocol is secure, but the application still trusts that something was delivered correctly. We also have some capabilities that we've worked on that have really stressed the web security model. I've been working on Project Fugu for the last 6 years, since before it was called Project Fugu. And we've stirred up a lot of arguments among implementers about whether powerful capabilities can be safely added to the web platform. And developers keep asking for more. And some of these capabilities, we agree, the normal web content really isn't trustworthy enough. So we want to keep applications on the web where possible, but we need a way to support these APIs in a safe way. So, spoiler, my proposal is to standardize an alternative model for distributing web content that provides stronger trust signals and robust integrity protections. So how are we going to get this? There are kind of 3 pieces. The first is packaging, integrity, and finally, isolation. So packaging means that we're going to take all the resources that are normally served on the web over HTTPS and package those into a web bundle, which is then also signed by the developer. And it can also be signed by trusted third parties like the browser vendor or their OS vendor. And because these things are coming from packages, installation is really a prerequisite. And this establishes a trust relationship with the source of the application and piggybacks on sort of user mental models about the capability and risks of installing applications onto their computer. Because these applications are coming from a package, they're not going to be served over HTTPS in the sort of normal way. And so each application gets its own unique origin on the new isolated app scheme. And updates, instead of kind of coming silently the way they do for websites, actually have to download a new bundle and replace it with the old one. And this is an area where this introduces additional friction for developers. And so we really do want to limit the number of apps that really have to go to these lengths. But for some applications, it could be necessary. Secondly, integrity. We really want to set a higher bar for security for these applications, particularly around things like cross-site scripting protection. And so we will require a strict content security policy and for developers to adopt things like trusted types. But packaging also gives us some additional powers that don't really make sense for normal websites. So for example, we can know at install time what permissions an application might request. Because we can look at we can look at the entire package, and so we can use things like tools like permissions policy to have an understanding holistically over the entire application about what features they're going to be used, and ask developers to declare upfront what features their application requires. And finally, isolation. So these things are really designed to behave like more like apps than websites, and so they'll always launch in a standalone window. and they can't be iframed inside of other content. And their storage is isolated from everything else, partially just because they exist on a different origin. We also want to make sure that they sort of can't get launched in strange and confusing ways. So navigation can only launch when they're going to kind of a predefined endpoint within the application. Though there are a lot of ways for developers to declare these through both things like the normal start URL, but also share targets and protocol handlers. So this isn't really a limitation; it just requires developers to think up front about what the entry points of their application really would be. And similarly, for outgoing navigations, if you click on a link inside of one of these that isn't going to a page in the application, that would load inside of the user's default browser, which is the same thing that happens when you click on a link in a native app. So when early on, I said things about about powerful APIs. So we think that with this new model, we can provide a secure and more trustworthy environment for enabling APIs which don't fit into the normal threat model. And our exploration of API requests have found kind of basically two categories of APIs that we've been looked at. First is extensions to existing APIs, and also sort of new, more powerful alternatives to things that actually do already exist on the web platform, but are limited based on sort of the existing platform security model. And so our goal here is to provide progressive enhancement for applications where they can be built with normal web technology and potentially also work as a normal website. But if they get installed and packaged through this mechanism, they get access to additional functionalities. And I see a question in the comments about what APIs are on our timeline. So if we go to the next slide, I have some examples. So on extensions to existing APIs, two that I'm going to call out here. First, on web authentication. So there's, if you've been paying attention to intents to prototype, there was an intent that went out for web authentication for remote desktop, which would allow a site to actually impersonate another origin to the relying party. And this sounds like a terrible idea, and this kind of part of the core sort of unfishability of WebAuthn. But this is necessary for users to authenticate in a remote browser. If you're using your browser inside of a remote desktop session, the remote desktop application has to interpose itself on any of your authentication requests, which means it needs to be able to impersonate any origin that you happen to be viewing on your web browser. Similarly, in the WebUSB API, we established this concept of protected device classes for things where there already are existing APIs that handle the things like storage and smart cards and cameras. But there are applications that need low-level control of these devices. And so with sufficient trustworthiness, then they may be able to get access to a lower level of control for that device. Next slide. We also are looking at more powerful alternatives to existing APIs. So the Direct Sockets API, which has been in development for a while, but never been entirely sure how it could be shipped because of the security concerns, is a low-level TCP and UDP socket API. That's an alternative to WebSockets and Web Transport. And on that sort of progressive enhancement theme, when we're talking to a web-friendly endpoint, those existing web APIs are really the preferred route. But sometimes when you're thinking about connecting to a legacy endpoint or a legacy application, there are situations where you need to be able to go down to the lower level of network connectivity. The final example here is a WebView API. So WebView and iframes are kind of the same concept, but there are a lot of restrictions on what you can do with an iframe. And so this is basically the completely unrestricted iframe API that would allow you to load content in whatever configurable storage partition you want to create and allow script injection into cross-origin content. So these are all things that you'd never want to do on the you never want to do on the web platform. We've built sort of the web platform security policy with opinions about how this kind of thing should work, but there are applications that need this. Next slide. So where are we today? We have published an explainer for this and are incubating inside the web platform incubator community group. And there's a prototype available in the Chromium project behind a flag. We discussed this at TPEC 2022 and heard some more interest from developers, as well as some cautious interest from other browser vendors. And I'm planning on filing official standards positions with Mozilla and Apple in the near future. So I'm going to open up for some discussion. We have about 20 minutes, and I want to start with some sort of some pre-written questions that I wanted that I'd like to hear the group's thoughts on. So first, one of the first things that people ask me when I'm talking about this project is this the web? And I would also sort of ask questions like, does it matter? So if, as you were hearing me talk about this, you had the thought like, this doesn't sound very much like the web with all these additional constraints and not using HTTPS. Speak up now. I'd like to hear sort of your opinion. Go ahead, Rick.
All right, that's a fascinating question. I'll bite if nobody else is going to bite. And maybe I'll just turn around by asking you a question. I often answer these doesn't matter questions, or like how much do we care about non-web scenario questions, by asking how much code is shared with things that are the web. You know, like I personally care about things that are delivered by HTTPS generally in terms of what I see as like my job. But if, for example, I can imagine applications that have a fully web version and then have an installed version that lights up with additional features. Are you imagining that is a use case for some of your cases, or are they more cases like the remote desktop client, for example, which is just an app that can't possibly, you know, exist without the, well, actually, no, I guess Chrome Remote Desktop is exactly that, right? It does exist as an open web thing. And if you install it, you could get some extra superpowers like remote authenticators, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. That you know, there are some applications where a power user, like I think in the remote desktop case, for example, is actually a perfect one, where like for a power user who uses security keys and really relies on some of these really tight integrations, they would never consider using it in a normal browser tab. But on the other hand, maybe they would if they were just borrowing someone's device, right? And so the power of the web is that they can use this thing with 95% of its functionality with all the ease of use that the web has. But if there's something that they really need, they also have the option of installing it and using the sort of more quote unquote full-featured version.
Tom's up next.
So my question, I'm part of the Open Wallet Foundation, where we're talking about whether or not we can use a PWA to hold a wallet. In order to do that, we'd really have to sign things, like with secure enclave keys. When you were talking about WebAuthn, were you talking about keys in the secure enclave?
So I was talking about specifically the sort of the authenticating to another site aspect of WebAuthn. So what was discussed yesterday with passkeys and such. I think there are lots of other, and I was also involved in like WebNFC, and I know people who have been working on digital wallets have been interested in WebNFC. So I can't really speak so much to the requirements around using a secure enclave in a PWA or those kinds of that kind of thing. It's possible that maybe a wallet application would have to be one of these really trustworthy applications, or maybe the browser could take on some of the sort of most trustworthy trust requiring functionality, but leave the front end to a PWA.
If I could continue, the problem we have with non-PWA wallets is that we can't communicate back and forth between the browser and the wallet very well. So if there was some way to be able to securely sign things, that would make my particular life a little easier.
Yeah, I would defer to the WebAuthn team directly, because I think they have the most experience with that kind of area.
I should bug them, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
All right, Penny.
So on to Rick's point about shared code, and mentioned that all the use cases that we see for this so far does start with a PWA. So it starts with a PWA and offers utility to the user in a tab. And then there are enhanced capabilities that may be required under either specific conditions for a user, or for the user to go a little bit deeper and do be more integrated with the device's capabilities than is possible in a tab. But it does begin with a web app that sits on the web origin, and then can evolve from there effectively.
All right, we have a local commenter. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think one question it raised for me is how do these applications kind of participate in linking? So can you deep link from the web into these isolated applications? And if you follow a link from the application to the open web, what happens? Is that a tabbed browsing experience? Do you have to go to a different app to browse that? How does that work?
Yeah, so I sort of covered this quickly in the isolation slide, but we have, like, we think of both inbound and outbound navigation sort of slightly differently. So outbound is easier. Outbound navigations link to a tab. So if you're in, your isolated web app for some feature, you click on a link that's outside the scope of that application, it opens a tab in your browser to kind of make it clear to the user the difference between what is the app and what is just a normal web experience. For inbound navigations, it's a little more interesting. So one of the requirements that we've gotten from the security team is to try to avoid these kinds of sort of confused deputy style attacks, where if an application has access to some powerful capability or is generally kind of trustworthy, we want to make sure that another malicious application can't sort of direct the user into it in a way that allows them to trick them into using that trust against the user's interests. So you could imagine, like, deep linking into a site like halfway through a checkout flow or something, or something like that. And so we have a set of navigation restrictions which are designed to basically make the goal is to make sure that if the developer allows an inbound a deep linking into the application, they've opted in to deep linking. And so there are a number of ways that you can do this as a developer on a PWA today. The start URL is obviously the primary endpoint, but things like share target, file handlers, protocol handlers can all be used to sort of register endpoints in the application that are expected to be reached by external, sort of from the outside. And so we just limit navigation to those to those places. So kind of the short answer is yes, the developer has to kind of opt in to deep linking, but that's a security property.
All right, another local conversation.
Okay, this is Jose de Pena. It's a couple of questions. First is more about the implementation. Where is it located in the tree? Is it at Chrome level? It's at components level? And the second question is about, there's some thoughts about trying to have the same APIs for low-level TCP and UDP access as the ones that are defined in Node.js.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a great segue into kind of the next question I had. So Tab, if you go to the next slide. So there's a question about how can we bring sort of non-browser implementers into the discussion. So to answer your first question really quickly, it's mostly in Chrome. We've put a little bit into content. There's been a little bit of a back and forth about sort of how standard is this feature, and therefore how in the content directory can it be. So right now it is mostly in Chrome, with some of it in content. That's going to shift around sort of as things stabilize on a standards from a standards perspective. But to the question of sort of how can, of getting things across multiple platforms, I think that take the Direct Sockets API as a perfect example. Yes, I'd like to see some level of standardization between what the TCP API looks like in a browser, in an isolated web app, and what it looks like in a Node application or a Dino application. Right now, these are three entirely separate APIs, right? Node has one socket API, Dino has a different socket API, and the browsers have WebSockets, which works kind of differently than Web Transport, which works kind of differently than Direct Sockets. So we've tried to keep actually Direct Sockets and Web Transport looking very, very similar. They both use the WhatWig Streams API, and my understanding is that Dino has also embraced the WhatWig Streams API, and so I think we will be able to use this as a way to get a little bit more parity in terms of the APIs that developers are using. Did that answer your question?
It did, yes. Not seeing anything else locally, Riley?
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of emphasize, as I said, this sort of second question here to think about is like, how can we bring down browser implementers? I talked about Node and Dino. I also mentioned previously Electron. Is this something that this is something that I think that previously I don't know a lot of people in Blink have. I don't know how much people in Blink have thought about this. And I'm curious for sort of people's thoughts on I think we spent a lot of time thinking about getting Mozilla on board, getting Apple on board. How much have we thought about these other sort of web-derived platforms?
Let's have Tom with their hand raised.
I was wondering exactly what you meant by non-browser implementers. One of the things that I tried to do was to talk between a browser and an app using some protocols that existed, and none of them were very secure. If there was some secure way to talk between a PWA and a native app, that would be fantastic. Is that what you're talking about, or something different?
It's not really what I'm talking about here, because in this case, I'm talking about other platforms which also use JavaScript, but aren't sort of a traditional web browser, and ways in which we can get some standardization of APIs between those two sort of form factors of applications. But I agree with your question that it would be nice to have more secure ways of communicating between native apps and web content. I don't know necessarily whether this proposal will be involved in that, but I agree with the premise.
If I wrote up something like that, could I send it to you for comments?
I'm always willing to comment on things. I might not be the best person to approve it.
You could at least tell me who to talk to.
This is true.
After, I'll send it to you. And
yeah. Can we get the next slide? So a kind of the last question I have here is on sort of dovetailing off the last one. If we have sort of non-browser involvement in this, what should the criteria for shipping IWA-specific APIs look like? And I have to admit, this is somewhat a question specifically directed at Rick, but I'm open to anybody's opinions on sort of what should we have the Blink launch process, and what should the Blink launch process look like for things, especially given the previous conversation about is this the web, is this not the web? If this is vaguely maybe not the web, should we have a slightly not the web launch process, or should it be the same? I'm open to people's opinions.
So since you singled me out, I'll go first. But I think there's other API owners currently in the room whose opinion is at least equally valid as mine. I'd love to hear from. But and maybe this goes to your previous question too. The how do we engage other browser vendor or other non-browser platforms, and have we thought much about it? And I've certainly been in some conversations where that question's come up, and mostly we've said that's not our job. Now maybe it is your job, or maybe there's parts of the team whose job it is, but certainly. For example, this has come up around Node, and hey, Node's cool. I'm glad. It's good to do something to support Node. I'm not against it, but personally, I don't see that as my goal, right? I think so. That's why I think we've actively chosen not to invest in doing some of those things, and I think there's even some things if you look at in the Chromium tree, there's some there's some stuff that Darren landed a while ago about. This came up in the context of people using Chromium for the TV broadcast standard, which is like a fork of HTML, right? And there's also been questions about ebooks, right? And every time these questions have come up, the answer has been, well, if you're building a fork of the web that's not the web, then we think you should do that in a fork of Chromium, not Chromium. But I think there's nuance there. I think there's probably LG folks here who have WebOS, right? And I think often we're able to find things that make sense to have upstream in Chromium as hopefully, without having WebOS specific things in the Chromium tree. So I think it's nuanced and complicated. But in terms of the criteria for shipping, isolated web app APIs. My opinion is that this is not subject to the Blink launch process, right? It's like similar like to extension APIs, right? Chrome extension APIs aren't subject to the Blink launch process because the questions of, I mean, there's debate whether interoperability is an important goal there or not, but like the Blink launch process is set up specifically to reduce pain for web developers. And so if you have another platform, interoperability, what's the right standards, all those I think are different questions. That's my opinion. Happy to hear different opinions. The one thing that does apply though still is code owners still applies, right? So maybe there's a separate question of what do the owners of the code that you want to change feel about having such code in their directories.
All right, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I agree largely with what Rick is saying. I think maybe there is some coordination like on the blurry edges that feel like it's kind of webby, kind of IWA, and maybe if we go through a couple of these, we learn like, oh yeah, like this is a thing that lives on its own, or maybe there is some like joint consultation. But I think I agree with Rick. If it's not the web, it's maybe a different process.
In particular, I think there's some fundamental questions we could ask ourselves to help figure out, like we don't want process for process sake, right? We have the Blink launch process, for example, to help ensure that anything that we ship could reasonably be supported by any other browser engine also, right? And so like a good question to ask ourselves is, hey, what would our friends at Mozilla think about these APIs? Would they feel, would they be worried that they're going to get forced into, feel like they're pressured into supporting one of these APIs someday? And if not, then some of the concerns around standardization maybe don't apply to the same degree, or maybe the bar is different or something like that. But it probably comes down to like who are the other stakeholders who would want to have a say. And for the Blink launch process, it's very specifically like the folks who ship other browser engines are stakeholders in our process.
I've got an in-person comment.
To me, the main question that we need to answer is how does this intermingle with web content? From the presentation, if I understand correctly, you can link from and into IWAs, but there is no scenario in which IWA code is loaded in a non-IWA way. And if that understanding is correct, then I agree with Rick and Mike on this being something that is not the web, and hence, like, there is no compat risk. There is no interop risk for the web. There may be at some point interop risk if there will be other browsers that implement this mode, but that's somewhat separate. So I agree. Assuming that my understanding is correct, I agree.
It is, and I think that's kind of where I am with the I have a draft sort of launch process inspired by the Blink launch process, and one of the things that I emphasize in there is that APIs, these APIs or changes to APIs should still be specified, because I do think that between getting compatibility with sort of non-browser environments that may be interested in this from a developer ergonomics perspective, and also looking forward to a potential future where there are sort of other runtimes for these applications, we should be thinking about making sure that these things are well specified, well tested, even if at the moment we are the only implementation.
I would like to play devil's advocate for a moment and say that I'm not sure this should be considered separate from the web. The web means different things to different people, and I think the biggest maybe principle or alleged principle of the web that is violated here is ephemerality. And maybe that one's not that important. And I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a very strident and opinionated, brave browser employee at TPAC a few years ago. And the point that they made, which I didn't take at face value, but I think still has some merit, is that the problem with web APIs that or that are not privacy preserving is that they don't reflect intentionality of the users, that the users expect web usage to be ephemeral and anonymous, and that if there were a mechanism for establishing intentionality of the user to install something in a more permanent way and to entrust it in a more permanent way, that would be more acceptable. And I think that maybe that's what this is, and maybe that doesn't have to be anti-web. Maybe it can go through the same standards process, and maybe we can even dare to hope that other vendors will appreciate that aspect of it and want to implement it as well.
Brian, you're up.
Yeah, so I'm sure that if I took some time to actually look into this, I would be able to articulate more and say what concerns I have or don't have. Since I don't, I'm not saying a lot, but I'm curious, like, what it does feel like. I mean, even to a lesser extent with Fugu, but Fugu is still at least trying to fit into the web model. Like, what does it even mean to do this and install? Seems like different in terms of like the guarantees that you get that people can understand, the protections that come from using a browser as opposed to installing a native app. Like, you can, and people do, provide a link to an APK, which you can just install. But I don't think anybody would say that's the web, right? Like, it's not. So, like, yeah, what can you say some more about that? Or I don't know, maybe like give us some good pointers about where to learn more. And I guess I just wanted to say, like, the fact that I haven't said I think this is the web or anything, it is more about that I just don't have enough information to comment intelligently than that I agree or something.
Understood. So I mean, I think that to both that and sort of the previous comment about like install and intentionality, yeah, I think that there is an interesting space that we're still exploring around PWAs and installability, around you know, what kinds of signals about the user's intent does install imply. And I think that this is probably kind of one space on sort of the far end of a spectrum, I think, where we would consider the user to have expressed a sort of very strong intention about installing. And if you want to learn more, like I said, that we have an explainer published, and there's a link to that at the end of the presentation. I recognize I think we've gone over it a little bit, and I just want to give Penny the last word.
The only thing I wanted to share about that is we are doing a lot of user experience research on user mental models and how we can use those models in a way to do more of what the user would expect and avoid doing things the user would not expect from the software that they're interacting with. Certainly the install journey is a major area of research for us in terms of like what does that activate for the user? What do users expect when they've gone through an install journey? What does that install journey need to disclose to the user?
All right, Tab, if you put the last slide up for a minute, and then I'll let the next presentation get, so I think we definitely run long.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. That was the end then? Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Riley. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.